Peace and long life. We come to serve 1986, The Transformers, the movie, animated.
You got the touch. You got the power.
There's no simple terms in which to put the Transformers, the original cartoon, to really capture how important it was to a generation. It was in that whole genre of the 80s that I grew up in, and I'm always talking about the transition from comic books, movies, cartoons aimed at younger kids, and intentionally wanting you to grow up with them in this fashion. And this was key. The Transformers had a background story to explain why they were turning into vehicles. We had a science fiction background that they arrived from another planet. They had been crashed on Earth for an epic amount of time, which probably wasn't the best consideration after it was successful, because it removed them from their planet and they had to figure out how to get them in touch with a place millions of years later, and yet not a lot had changed. But that's a whole other issue. But the idea of how they arrived on Earth, why they looked like Earth vehicles, why they were what they were, there was a basic setup for that, at least, that allowed you to understand the conflict between good and evil, the Autobots and the Decepticons. With the movie and the transition, therefore, to season 3, they really did a great, what we would call now, retconning. They really went out of their way to step up their game. They copied a lot of Japanese anime that was becoming popular at the time. They gave us a soundtrack by the guy that did Rocky, and it sounds very Rocky-ish. And they gave us, well, they set up for what became the big transition to a more adult, more science fiction adult storyline. I loved Transformers the movie. I did not actually see it at the theater. I was a kid at the time, and it wasn't something we would have gone to see as a family. In fact, I didn't actually watch the animated movie. I'm pretty sure I rented it from a Blockbuster when I was at college. So it was a number of years went by. It was about 6 years later after the fact. So I was stuck as a boy piecing it together, what had happened when suddenly it arrived back to season 3, and I did get a little bit of flashback, but they did not go out of their way to cover everything. The really important advantages of the movie was, well, okay, I don't know exactly how to say this. It allowed the show to transform, nice expression, into something more adult with a deeper science fiction background. But the thing is, they didn't actually do that in the movie. In the 5-part, 5 Faces of Darkness that followed the movie and began season 3, we find out about the Quintessons and how they ruled Cybertron, how they had built it, how they had essentially made it a factory for robots that were on the market then, galactically speaking. We get the rebellion. Everything sort of makes a lot more consistent science fiction type sense about why they exist, what happened, where they come from, and what the conflict is, and who the Quintessons are, who now have re-entered as sort of the other bad guy who dream of getting control of Cybertron again and the transforming robots. What an incredible thing that would have been to get in Transformers the movie, but we don't get it there. We get it immediately following. Whereas in the animated movie, well, we get the Quintessons, the Sharkticons, we get a visit to their planet, but we get like almost nothing to explain who these entities are, why they're hostile, what they're up to, what the gag is with the dark way that they declare people innocent and then feed them to the Sharkticons. None of that is explained. One of the other big important things that happens on the cusp of Transformers the movie, of course, for toys and for marketing, but the introduction of a lot of new characters. We see the death of some of the old characters, the beginning of a transition to a new era, which again, it is both marketing to allow more toys to be sold, but it does fit better with a more adult and more science fiction sort of understanding. And these people that are at war, these robots have been at war for millions of years. This is the story. There has to be casualties. There just has to be. And of course, because it's a kid's cartoon in that same flavor as G.I. Joe at the time, where tanks and planes explode and people just bail out with parachutes and like nobody seems to get killed, the Transformers stepped it up, and we see Ironhide and Ratchet and others. We see them being killed early in the movie. And of course, most infamously, Optimus Prime himself. We see this transition, however, to these new characters to be primary, new leadership, and a new story going forward that does, again, all of it makes it more plausible, realistic, in a real world sense, and in an established science fiction conflict sort of sense. The downside to that, and a lot of people, I was surprised to discover this was a huge trauma of my generation. People were really mad that Optimus Prime was killed. I personally didn't mind that. I was always a huge fan of the Decepticons. I loved Megatron. I really liked Starscream too, and it was nice to see him, despite being killed, being able to come back later as a ghost in season 3. But I was always sort of conflicted because I liked the interaction between them and that struggle for leadership. And I really thought that, well, bad guys are usually more interesting, but I really liked the Decepticons. I always felt, even as a child, that Optimus Prime wasn't just lame because he was a good guy, but he was very one-dimensional, sort of, I'm like the 1960s Batman good guy thing. And again, that's part of it being aimed at a younger audience, at least at the beginning. So it didn't bother me at all to see Optimus Prime die. I thought it was fabulous to see Megatron survive that and become Galvatron. It's only after the fact that it clearly becomes a mistake. It is clearly erroneous. It was a bad decision. And it's a bad decision in a couple of ways. One is Rodimus Prime, and this is not the fault of the transition itself, but the fault of the writing. Moving from Hot Rod to become Rodimus Prime, the guy that rises from the ranks. All of this, by the end of the movie, makes a sense that you're ready to go forward with that. At least I felt. Potentially, you've got a more adult-themed leadership of the Autobots, and you have a new character and new toys, and suddenly he goes from being the hero of the end of the movie to being completely lame and weak when they get back to the series. He's the troubled, uninspiring leader who languishes in the shadow of Optimus Prime and doesn't feel like he ever lives up to it. And that is, at one time, simultaneously, that is both more adult-oriented. It is sort of more realistic that he might be that way. But at the same time, it makes a terrible leader, and it makes a terrible character. And in a cartoon where you're still trying to continue this conflict of good and evil, and there's a few times where the whole episode kind of revolves around Rodimus Prime figuring out that he can man up and do it. But then because of whatever writing schedule or story is next, he's lost his confidence again by the next episode. In hindsight, then, not only the trauma that all those people that loved Optimus Prime felt, but what they end up doing with Rodimus, in hindsight, it's very much a mistake the way they did that transition. In fact, as much as I am a huge fan of Megatron and I loved Galvatron, in hindsight, it might have been smarter to have Megatron be destroyed and Starscream get rebuilt to become the leader, to resolve sort of that conflict of that struggle for leadership of the Decepticons and transition it to another generation. And then in reversal, have it be that Optimus Prime gets rebuilt as Rodimus Prime. And you even keep the voice to keep the consistency. Then you've still got a new toy and sort of a new character. And you've got a continuity where your hero has managed to survive slimly and your bad guy has died along with some of the other minor good guy characters. In hindsight, that probably would have been a smarter thing to do. But the transition of it to a real science fiction story is kind of what allows it to be still the phenomenon that it is. And full disclosure, I watched the first Michael Bay movie. That was it. I have not seen any of the other, and it isn't that I haven't seen enough of it to judge its overall quality, but it was not the Transformers from my childhood, which was disappointing, not just because I loved the way it was, but we finally had the CGI and other technologies available to do that and do it realistic, step it up a little bit and have it be good. And instead they did the whole, we're going to completely reimagine it and reboot it, and it's all going to be weird and different. Now, G.I. Joe, the movie, which is a whole other story, but I wanted to mention along this line, they seem to have learned from the era of Optimus Prime, where Duke becomes terribly wounded, but he does survive. But they also capture what the movie Transformers did not, the animated film. That G.I. Joe, the movie, gives us Cobra-La and this sort of true secret origin of Serpentor, who I loved. I mean, I loved Cobra Commander as a guy who loved the villains, but Serpentor was just amazing. This I command. But they gave us finally they gave us a background instead of just a generic terrorist organization that wants to rule the world. What's the conflict? What's the ideology? And by giving us the mythological lost kingdom still existing of Cobra-La and rejecting the technological civilization that now exists on the earth and wanting to return to this sort of primitive but yet advanced biotechnical, it really was they gave G.I. Joe the sort of science fiction alternate history sort of background connection that gave it a more plausible reason why the conflict existed. And they were smart enough not to kill their leader Duke, and they were smart enough to still give you the new characters, the new toys, therefore the new vehicles, and the new intro, the intro to that movie with them yelling Cobra. It's like one of my favorites. So they seem to have learned from the mistakes of Transformers after it was released, and yet, but this was sort of the crux. Both of those movies together were the transition of those cartoons from being just good guy, bad guy, sort of aimed at a young audience, and yet transitioning now into the kids are getting a little older. Maybe we want to draw in more kids. Kids that are a little bit older are going to want more of the kinds of delicate and complicated toys that we can sell them. So you want to go from GoBots to Transformers to a new Transformers universe, and you want G.I. Joe to be stepped up from being an elite team versus random, literally faceless terrorists with their faces covered with no real ideology, and giving it an actual conflict substantially that makes it plausible and more desirable going forward. I did see the recent G.I. Joe movies. Well, I should do a different review on that. But a lot like the Michael Bay Transformers, when things are updated too much, and this is the real tragedy I feel for my generation, that now we have the technology to do these things and do them well. And instead, we're getting the whole, well, we're going to reboot and reimagine it for a whole new generation. And it's weird and it's different. And on the off chance that they still do something good, it's still not the original. But the original animated Transformers is something I own a digital copy. I can watch it over and over. And I have to admit, when I'm driving around on my playlist right now, along with, well, some of those Rocky movies and famous songs like Eye of the Tiger, I have a couple of the great songs from Transformers, the animated movie, because what do? I got the touch, you got the power. I mean, that's some good stuff. Nothing's going to stand in our way tonight, and etc. Anyway, I won't destroy what audience I have with any more of my saying. But Transformers, the movie, I loved it. I thought it was amazing. But those were the weaknesses, that real cusp to an actual background story that we don't get until after and we could have got. And in hindsight, the switching of the characters, what they did should have been reversed. Optimus Prime should have survived in some fashion and had more of a transition with Megatron and Starscream. But now that I've said all this, I'm probably going to go watch it again this evening because if nothing else, I can sing along with the music. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Live long and prosper.
I accept your terms. I accept your